gives me great pleasure to welcome Marisa and Mickey. We have known each other for close to a decade now. When we first met, like I said, roughly a decade ago, I was really taken aback by your story. You know, it was a really powerful story. Maybe just to start out, if you could just tell us a little bit about, you know, your background, your life, and we'll go from there and go on the journey of lupus as well.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been great so far. Let's see. Well, I'm going to give you some time references because they're important. So I just turned 48 and I started having lupus symptoms, I would say very clearly at the age of 8, which was mid-80s, never really heard the word lupus and no doctors. And my mom and I went to see a lot of doctors. No doctors ever mentioned it or even tested me for it. So it was just like this revolving door of not really understanding what was going on. And, you know, children are really adaptable and I just sort of learned how to live with it. But at the same time, I knew I was not like other children. And I needed naps and I missed a lot of school and I lost my hair and I couldn't be out in the sun, which is very hard when you move from New York City to Fort Lauderdale. So I stayed inside a lot. But yeah, I just sort of learned to live with it. Often in the autoimmune world, there's usually a trigger. When I was in camp at 8 years old and I got mono and then I got Coxsackie virus, I had all these viruses, right? And then my immune system sort of went crazy. But when I was in nursing school, I was 23 and I was crossing a street one night in Fort Lauderdale and I actually got run over by a drunk driver at 50 miles an hour. And I spent that next year recovering from that. And that was the trigger that fully brought out every lupus symptom. But the difference was this time, all of the symptoms came out at once, which I think was what the issue was for so long. Going into a doctor, especially when you have an invisible disease, you're tired. And then the next time you come in, you might have a rash. But for everything to happen at one time, I think that was like that key for the rheumatologist in the hospital to finally figure out what was going on.
And could you tell us a little bit more about that, you know, that trigger? I remember, you know, you telling me many moons ago, you know, what that was like while you were actually in the hospital, and then how did you feel when you finally got to the diagnosis?
For so long, just growing up, you hear that doctors, right, you look to them as the person that can help you and will heal you and make you feel better. And so I held on to that hope for a really long time. I got run over. Obviously, I had horrific injuries that I was already recovering from, and then I got sick. And on top of those injuries, like rashes, fevers, you know, I had a mini stroke, and I was able to see different types of doctors, which is what I needed. So my mom and I didn't have health insurance. It was, again, you know, mid-80s and just my mom didn't have a lot of money, so we couldn't see the doctor often. But now I had this opportunity in the hospital to see infectious disease, to see rheumatology, and they were all listening. And they knew, it was very clear something else was going on aside from the injuries I had from being hit. I don't know, it was very hopeful, but I always explain that moment as very bittersweet because I knew for so long, like we know our body intimately, I knew for so long that something was not right. And so now I finally have an answer. But in that moment, I think as important as it was that I had that answer finally, that I could make a path moving forward, I had no idea what I was in store for. But of course, I didn't know really what lupus was. I think we went over at nursing school for about 4 minutes and it sounded awful. So it was like, wait, I have that? And I think that's the most important thing about being a patient advocate is for the people coming in behind you. Like, no doctor could in that 15 or 20 minutes tell me what my life was going to be like moving forward and how that will always talk about, like, lupus is like water. It will infiltrate every single area of your life.
And maybe you could share a little bit more with us, you know, what is that like on a day-to-day basis?
I think lupus, and I hear this from a lot of chronic illness warriors, like there's so much negotiation and management that comes into every single day because you realize that every single thing you do has a cost. So like, I'll use this trip for example. I knew the whole day of flying, I needed sort of a day to just sort of relax and rest. And then going back home, I know that I'll probably spend 2 or 3 days in bed and not be able to work. But is the cost, is it worth it, right? With everything that you want to do, with what you see as your purpose. If I'm having really good energy one day, like how much do I want to get off of my to-do list so that I'm not in bed tomorrow or I'm not in the hospital in a few days from now? You don't know that when you're first diagnosed. And I absolutely did not, because I am definitely type A and I always want to go. And I would push my body to the brink over and over again. And I just kept winding up in the hospital. And so I just needed to learn sort of what those guardrails are. For people that aren't sick, it's never about willingness with a patient or someone that, like for me that has lupus, like I always want to do it. I always want to go. I don't want to miss events. I want to be with my family, but it's about capacity. It's like, how much capacity do I have that day? And I don't know that until every morning. Every morning is different. And I know within the first 5 or 10 minutes, pretty much, how much I will be able to get done that day. And it's just imagine, if you come into this office like 40 hours a week, I don't know what your schedule is, but every day is different. So I always say that we live our life in pencil, not ink.
You used a certain term, hidden, right, as you were talking about it before. I'd love to hear you in your voice. What does that mean? What does that feel like, that you feel like you have something hidden?
Yeah, so for me, I don't regularly get any skin issues. It's happened, but not very often. So I know that by looking at me, most people assume that I'm healthy. And so that has obviously taught me to consider everybody's story, that every single person I walk past, like I have no idea what they're going through, whether it's, an autoimmune disease, mental health, and I think it's helped me become just more curious about people, get to know people's story, not to make assumptions about people's lives, have more compassion for people. I think a part of us, right, you want to be accepted in some way, but then at the same time, how sick do I need to look for someone to actually pay attention and take me seriously? And that's a really weird line to walk. I had a time when I went to an emergency room and I couldn't breathe, and I was actually having a pulmonary embolism, and the doctor told me I just needed more sun. Well, I'll tell you, sun is my biggest trigger. I don't know, there's just moments like that will never leave my mind. And that's just another reason why I try to advocate, I live with this, it demands a lot of me, but I think especially with social media, like the days that I'm in treatment, I do try to show those. But the days that we're really sick and we're in bed, and I always say I look like I just rolled out of a dumpster, like it's pretty bad. Like people don't see us on those days, right? We're home or we're in the hospital.
You mentioned the unpredictability and how you have to manage your day around that. How does that impact things like your family life, your relationships, your work, your day-to-day? How do you navigate that? What is people's level of understanding? How do you approach that?
For me, my baseline is always fever and fatigue. So I always tell people, imagine your first day of COVID or the flu and how tired you are and that fever. And that is what I work with every morning when I wake up in the morning. And that's a normal day for me. So when the flare hits, it's, a more intense fever. I feel like as a family, we have this routine now, and you sort of become more comfortable with your body. You know what triggers symptoms, and you try to keep those at bay as much as possible. But it's been really hard in my career to find employers that understand, like I might be out like for IV treatments, and I might need a day like remote after that. It's a little bit different now post-COVID, I think, but working and finances have been difficult, and obviously relationships and missing big events sometimes, which we don't like to do, but it happens. And I feel like for me, because I'm pretty blunt, like I'll explain to people like this is what's happening and I can't go. And the reality is some people will be very understanding and other people will think that it's an excuse. Or I'm not really sick because they just saw me 4 days ago on Instagram and I was out to eat, right? But they don't know how much it took the 2 or 3 days before that for me to go to that event. So I try to explain as much as possible, but I also don't, I guess, let it have so much room in my life for the people that don't really want to educate themselves or really understand. And unfortunately, like, some of that is even your own family, which I think is really hard with a chronic illness. It wasn't until there was a moment where, years ago, where I had to go on chemo during a certain flare, that certain family members, like, really started to come into our life and be like, oh, you're really sick. And I'm like, it's because they heard this chemo word, right? And it's like, well, no, I've been sick for a really long time.
What we learned, because you don't want to have to explain to everyone over and over again what lupus is and what's going on. Some people didn't realize why we missed events, and that became kind of, we had to really learn to navigate that, and we had to learn to just kind of be blunt and honest in that. And some people, they disappear from your life because they can't handle that you can't commit to certain things and be there.
Remember, like, when I was diagnosed, there was no social media. You know, there was, blogs were just coming on the scene. I lived in a city of millions of people, and I only knew one other person with lupus. So for about 3 years, I'd say, I decided I did not have lupus. And when I say I decided that, I never talked about it. I decided I wasn't going to take my medicine because I was going to be fine, you know, and it wasn't a big deal. And that really did not work well at all. I was almost ashamed for it because I think back then there was no awareness. If I had been diagnosed today with how many people are out there talking about it, and that, you know, there's billboards, there's advertisements on television, maybe I wouldn't have felt so much shame for being diagnosed with something that, like, people couldn't even honestly pronounce back then.
When it first happened, and you know, she was basically bedridden. We couldn't leave the house without a wheelchair. Like, when things really kicked in right after, you know, marriage, and you feel so alone. There was only a couple of books that had anything to do with lupus. There was no new medicines for, you know, 40, 50 years, and you feel so alone, like there's nothing. You know, but that's just part of it. You know, taking it day by day, and getting through that day and getting to the next.
In thinking about your journey through the healthcare system, can you reflect on what that was like, where you are today as well, being able to navigate that, being able to be your own advocate, the types of reactions you get from healthcare providers? Has that changed over time?
I have found some incredible doctors in the last 10 to 20 years that really listen. I feel like, especially now with just how much awareness there is, it's just different. It's very different than when I was obviously growing up in the 80s. I don't know, there's been like a lot of advancements, I feel like.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk a little bit about that, you know, the advancements and the therapeutics. You know, could you describe a little bit more about your journey there, and, you know, how do you think about some of the new therapies that are coming out or are currently in clinical trials, you know, just thinking about the future?
I'm so excited. Like, I just feel there's such a different energy in just the last, like, year or two, because I think for so long, just the lupus community in general, if you speak to many of us, it has felt like an area where we felt ignored for a very long time, like, obviously using off-label medications to treat symptoms. And a lot of those medications are really hard on the body, and they cause a lot of other issues. And so, you know, you're trying to find stability with medicine, but one for at least yourself, that you can live with the side effects and what it's doing to your body. I'm going and I'm taking medicine 3 to 4 times a day. So, like, every couple of hours I have to stop and take something that I know, like, it's just a reminder that I'm sick, and that if I don't take this, I could die, right? And it just never leaves your mind, and that's just how you live. And I just want to be free of that. Like, to be able to know that I can take something and possibly fully participate in my life and not have to worry that, is it time to take my medicine again? And I just feel like we live with that pretty much every single day.
So what does good look like for you? If you were us developing a new medicine, like, what would you want out of that? What would you be looking for?
it is encouraging to be in a room and humbling that, you know, people, look, this is your profession, this is what you've chosen, this is what you're working on. That's awesome because, you know, there are people who have sat waiting, you know, for, gee, does anybody know? Does anyone care what I'm feeling?
I think, you know, we just want like time back. I feel like I miss a lot of time. I lose a lot of time in life. Like I was sick, you know, in December. I was down for 5 weeks. I missed every holiday. I just slept for 5 weeks. So it's like you miss these gaps of time, and I think that, you know, I want that time back. I would love to not have to take any more medication. That's my biggest, and just to not have various symptoms every single day of my life. Like I never know every morning, like what part is gonna be like ramped up. I have never been in a remission in decades, you know, so I've never had a day where there isn't something. I would love to have like the last half of my life to be my life.
You have a room full of people here, right, that spend every single day trying to develop new therapies for people living with lupus and other autoimmune disorders. If there were one impactful thing that you would tell this room, and there's scientists, there's clinicians, there's, you know, people who work in general administrative functions, so many different flavors, right, of people who come to work together on a company. What would be the one thing you would tell them about what we do, and you know, what inspires you, and what would you want to see from us?
To have had the opportunity like today to meet with, you know, companies and people who this is part of their life, is to try to find solutions or a way to bring solutions forth, is very encouraging to us.
Well, first I just want to say I'm very thankful for all of you. I would just say keep going, because like there's millions of people, there's millions of me's out there that are hoping, honestly, you save our life one day. Like that's our hope.